Kia ora and welcome to the first Screenlab for Compo 230. In this lab we'll be looking at the essential technical skills that you will need for idiomatic and effective writing for orchestral strings. It's important to note that this is really only the basic need-to-know information. To become a more well-rounded, more professional orchestrator, you should read through your orchestration books and online resources and research the historical development of the instruments. And it wouldn't hurt to find out some of the physics behind the instrumental acoustics as well. In short, the more networks of knowledge you can create around this, the better. While the contents of this lab should be mostly a refresher of the essential skills you learned in Compo 130, it's important that you progress beyond merely an understanding of these skills to the point where you have internalized them and no longer need to think too long or too hard about them. The purpose of this course is to move you to a point where recalling specific details is instantaneous or, at most, only takes a second or two. Now, if you're a string player, you'll have a distinct advantage, of course, but if not, don't worry. After this course, I hope you'll feel much more confident writing for strings. Having said that, the more you can immerse yourself in the live sound of orchestral strings, the better. To that end, I suggest going along to watch the NZSM Orchestra rehearse on a Tuesday and Thursday afternoon in the Adam Concert Room, and pay close attention to the strings. Pay particular attention to what their bows are doing, and don't be afraid to mime along with them. Air bowing is one of the most common tricks that composers use to understand the physics of what they're writing. One other thing, all of the great orchestrators understood the central role of the strings in creating their colourful and compelling musical language. If you really want to move beyond just a basic craft of orchestration and immerse yourself into the colour and richness of a true orchestrational art, then I suggest that you not just read scores by the great orchestrators, but imbibe them. And in the scheme of the development of advanced string techniques, I can think of three great orchestrators of the 20th century that you should know back to front: Claude Debussy, Maurice Ravel, and Igor Stravinsky. To show you why I think these three composers exemplify a virtuosic idiomatic approach to strings, we're going to look at three typical passages that demonstrate the incredible coloristic potential of the strings. The first is this magical passage from Debussy's Lemire, which depicts a shimmering play of light on water. Debussy captures the sense of shimmer in a number of ways. Firstly, a very high artificial harmonic played by half of the first violins, above an undulating tremolo in the cellos, and 4 solo double basses. The violas and second violins enter with bow tremolos marked sur la touche, or on the fingerboard. The various types of oscillation framed with a very high and very low pedal point, and only in a select number of the strings, give this passage a sense of delicate static motion. Let's now look at a typical up-tempo string passage that might be found in the orchestral works of Ravel. This one comes from his piece La Melodie, or the Mother Goose Suite. The writing produces an incredible energy, vitality, and colour. But where does that colour come from? It's more than just the fast rhythms, it's the dazzling array of idiomatic techniques that he uses in the strings. In bar 1, there's a pizzicato quadruple stop in the violins, violas, and cellos, while the second violins have a harmonic glissando on the A string. In bar 2, the violins quickly change to arco, divisi, and bowed tremolo, while the seconds and cellos have a fingered tremolo. In bar 3, the cellos have an artificial harmonic. The last extract we'll look at is from Stravinsky's Firebird suite. Again, we see incredible virtuosity in the handling of the strings. On the first beat, an arpeggiando figure crossing 3 strings is followed by a thrown off the string jeté, leading to a trill, while the second violins have a fingered tremolo. This on the string, off the string contrast continues for 4 bars, but notice that the cellos and basses have rapid pizz arco changes. In the bar before 12, the first switch to pizz before very quickly changing to arco for half a beat, then back to pizz again. The second violins have sharp off-the-string marcato figures, All of these rapid techniques and oscillations, not to mention the lightness and percussive nature of the numerous pizzicato notes, brings an incredible sense of lightness, colour and movement to this passage, as we might expect of the mythical fiery creature dancing before us that Stravinsky is trying to depict. The first thing we need to do is to clarify exactly which instruments we're talking about. So, in a standard symphony orchestra, the strings are divided into 5 sections. The first violins, the second violins, violas, cellos, and double basses. The exact number of instruments within those sections vary depending on the kind of sound you want to get out of the string section and on the orchestra itself. Now, for your first minor assignment in Compo 230, you'll be arranging for a string quintet that includes bass. Now, this is a somewhat unusual quintet formation. It's more typical to double the viola or cello, but it does have 2 advantages for this course. One, it allows you to reach some of the lower notes of the piano piece that the cello wouldn't be able to get. And 2, it acts as a rehearsal for writing for the full orchestral string section that you'll be doing in Compo 330. And it allows you to deal with the different registers and registral intensities and colours of the instruments that you can expect to find in the orchestra. Let's have a look at the instruments. They're all similar in construction, 4 strings stretched over a wooden bridge, amplified by the resonant wooden body through which the vibrations travel. The first key thing that composers and orchestrators must learn is the standard tuning of the 4 strings. If you know these off by heart, it will help you in a number of ways. If you know what the pitch of the open strings is, it will help considerably when trying to work out multiple stops, harmonics, and fingering patterns and positions. Although composers can request that strings are tuned differently, this is called scordatura, for the purposes of this course we're only going to deal with the standard tuning. All of the strings, apart from the double bass, are tuned to perfect fifths. I always find it helpful to think about the lowest string on the instrument because it defines a clear boundary that the instrument can't go any lower than. In certain situations, the strings on the instruments are numbered. I'll tell you when later on, but for now I'll label the strings so you can see which ones they are. The lowest string is always string number 4, or IV in Roman numerals. Please note that these string numbers do not normally appear in a score except in a few rare circumstances that we'll cover in the next lab. The lowest string on the violin is tuned to a G3. On the viola it's C3. And on the cello it's C2. Note that when you play a violin, the G string is actually on your left. The cello, on the other hand, is played vertically resting between the knees, so the C string is actually on the right-hand side of the fingerboard. The double bass has 4 strings too, but they're tuned in perfect fourths, with the bottom string a low E. 2 other important things to know about the double bass. Firstly, it is in fact a transposing instrument sounding an octave lower than written. So when you see the bass playing the same line as the cellos, they are in fact playing parallel octaves. Of course, this causes problems if the cello line drops below a low E, which brings me to my second point. Professional orchestral bass players usually have a low C extension, which is mounted above the fingerboard onto the scroll, providing extra length for the E string to allow it to be lengthened, dropping it to a low C, which is obviously intended to allow them to continue doubling the cellos an octave lower even when they drop beneath an E. If you're writing for an amateur orchestra, however, you shouldn't expect that the bass players have this facility, so it's best to avoid writing below an E unless you're absolutely sure that your bassists have an extension. Okay, so let's summarize the tunings of the orchestral strings. Violins are E, A, D, G. I've numbered the strings with their Roman numerals here. Violas are tuned similarly to violins except without the E string, and with a low C string at the bottom, so that's A, D, G, and C. Cellos are tuned the same as violas, but an octave lower, also A, D, G, C. Double basses have their own special tuning system in fourths, G, D, A, E, but you can think of it as the same as violin tuning, only backwards. Remember too that the sounding pitch of these is an octave lower than written. The thing about string tunings is that they make a clear boundary below which you cannot go on a particular string. This is important to remember, for example, when working out double stops. For instance, you can't have an A flat and a C double stop on a violin because the A flat would be played on the G string, but the C is too low to be played on the D string. We'll talk more about multiple stops later on, but always remembering the tuning of these strings as a lower boundary is important to keep in the back of your mind. On the other hand, the upper boundary of these strings is only limited by the length of the fingerboard, and in fact you can even keep going higher than the end of the fingerboard, playing right up to where the bow is positioned, although generally this is only for extremely professional players in contemporary pieces. Now here's an example from a string quartet of mine, Exitus, in which I asked cellist Rolf Johnston to play with his thumbnail on the A string right up by where the bow is. The notes he could produce were astonishingly high but extremely hard to control. Each note is less than a millimetre apart, so the end result is really only an approximation of what's in the score. So let's clarify what we'll call the working ranges of the instruments. These are the ranges that you can comfortably write for professional string players. Note that even at the top of these ranges the players might not be entirely comfortable, but you can rightly expect them to play it without complaining too openly. If you're writing for amateur musicians, however, these upper bounds really need to come down. So the rule of thumb is that, generally speaking, professional musicians are happy to play up to about 2 octaves above the open strings. Note that for the cello I've indicated a higher note than the A 2 octaves above the open string. But above that A you should proceed with care and if possible allow the player to use natural harmonics. And note also that although I've written a top G for the double bass, you probably don't want to go much above a B flat in the middle of the treble staff, again unless you're in harmonics. Now onto a note about clefs. Firstly, never ever use ottava bassa for strings. In fact, pretty much the only 2 instruments in the entire orchestra that need ottava bassa are piano and harp. Now the only instrument that ever needs ottava is the violin when you start getting more than 4 ledger lines for a reasonably sustained passage of music. In this example, the ottava sign is not necessary. It can simply be written up the octave with no problem at all. But in this example, we've got 4 or more ledger lines for a reasonably sustained passage of time, therefore it could well be rewritten with an ottava sign. You should also never write an ottava in any clef other than the treble clef. So in this example we've got an alto clef with an ottava sign. This should simply be rewritten in the treble clef. Now I said before that the only instrument that ever needs an ottava sign is violin. That's not strictly true. The other instruments, if they're writing in an extreme register, can use ottava or even quintessima, but they'd have to be doing something pretty extreme, as you saw in my quartet Exitus. Now let's talk about the clefs. Firstly, the violins only ever play treble clef. In fact, violinists don't really read any other clef than that. For viola, their default clef is the alto clef. But if you're getting multiple ledger lines in the alto clef, then switch to treble clef. These are the only 2 clefs that the viola reads. The cello has 3 possible clefs: bass, tenor, and treble. Bass is the default clef, but tenor is used reasonably often when there's a sustained passage up on the A string. The treble is only used when you'd otherwise get multiple ledger lines in the tenor clef. The double bass is similar to the cello. It reads bass, tenor, and treble as well. Okay, now let's turn to the bow. Fully understanding the physics and idiomatic uses of the bow is the difference between an all-right orchestrator and an outstanding orchestrator. I'll show you why in a minute. Firstly, let's talk about how the bow contacts the string. There are essentially two main ways in which this happens. The first is that the bow is moved across the string to create the sound, without the contact between the bow and the string being broken, although the player may stop the string at any time. This is called on-the-string bowing. The second way is that the player takes the bow off the string and brings it down onto the string to create the sound. This is called off-the-string bowing. Off-the-string bowing can be done deliberately, such as with a ricochet stroke, when the bow is brought down onto the string with a reasonable force so that it bounces off again, or it can be merely a side effect of a stroke, such as a fast staccato stroke or spiccato, in which the speed of the stroke makes the bow automatically leave the string. We saw in Ravel's and Stravinsky's scores that they loved to rapidly alternate between on-the-string and off-the-string bowing techniques in up-tempo passages. There are 6 main on-the-string bowing techniques. They are détaché, in which each note occurs in a separate bow stroke; legato, in which multiple notes occur under one bow stroke; tenuto, in which each note receives its full length and with a slight emphasis; louré, in which repeated notes are played in one bow stroke with a slight detachment; staccato, in which, when it's played at a moderate speed, the bow simply stops on the string without breaking contact; and tremolo, or bow tremolo, in which the bow rapidly oscillates backwards and forwards on the string. Then there are 3 main off-the-string bowings. There's martelé, in which you use a triangle staccatissimo notation to create a raw, heavy sound; spiccato, which is essentially a staccato at a faster speed and the bow starts detaching or bouncing off the string; and then jeté or ricochet, in which the bow bounces in one direction, and you notate that with slurred staccatos. There are a number of other parameters that can affect the bowing technique. These include the bow position, such as playing sul testo or over the fingerboard, playing sul ponte or near the bridge, or molto sul ponte very close to the bridge. You can also alter the bow pressure from flortando, a very light stroke, to crunch tone, which is pushing down into the string with a very heavy force. You can also change what object is striking or stroking the strings. If you notate col legno, for example, that means with the wood of the bow rather than the hair of the bow. And you can indicate either col legno trato to indicate that you should bow with the wood, or col legno battuto to indicate that you should strike the strings with the wood. Now here's a video of violinist Erik Silberger playing some of these techniques rather beautifully.
Ricochet is created when the bow is thrown onto the string and the bow bounces naturally. Détaché is a separate stroke, often played in rapid succession, and it's very useful because it's in almost every kind of piece and almost the entire repertoire in violin. Spiccato sautille is a stroke that is created when the bow is moving horizontally rather quickly, and the natural bounce of the bow gradually creates a bouncing stroke. Tremolo is a stroke most often used in orchestral playing. It is created when the bow is moving back and forth very rapidly, often without any defined meter. Ponticello is a wispy sound created by playing very close to the bridge on the violin. Col legno is a stroke created by throwing the wood of the bow onto the strings of the violin, creating a very different effect. Colle, meaning stuck, is created by a great deal of resistance on the string and then a release. Martellet, a hammered stroke, is created by catching the string and then releasing it into a longer stroke. Staccato is a stroke that is utilized through regular up bow or down bow usage of rapid martellet strokes, with multiple accents being placed on one bow. Legato is created by sustaining the bow on the string through multiple notes.
One of the hardest aspects of understanding bowing is working out how you indicate to the player your preferred bowing. Firstly, as a general rule, you should not indicate up bows or down bows unless you want to indicate something that is contrary to what the performer might interpret, especially multiple up bows or multiple down bows. The latter is particularly common when you want a strong, repeated accent, such as in this canonic example from Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. We'll get into the ins and outs of slurring your passages at a later date. That's a topic for a whole other lab video. Until then, that's all for today. Please review the material in this video and ensure you can recall the key pieces of information. We've set up some practice resources for you at the following URL. If you can get 10 out of 10 in under 1 minute 30, then you're on the right track.